I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!
Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to everyone in Bowling Green or listening on the internet, wherever or whenever you may be. My name is Joseph D. DeMare, and I'm here with my quick-witted co-host,
Rebecca Wood.
For the next hour, Rebecca and I will be bringing you an unusual and informative program called For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment, and we talk about them in the ways that they affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, and the wealth and health and happiness of your friends and family. And the health of the recently discovered Borg microorganisms, which seem to be just strings of DNA that exist by themselves deep in mud, up on through the viruses and the mycoplasms and the bacteria, and the eukaryotes, all the way up to multicellular organisms. Because the truth is, we're all stuck here with each other on this impossibly rare planet called Earth, and we all need to start treating each other like good neighbors. We've got a great show lined up for you again today. We're just going to chat a bit for the next 10 minutes or so. Then we have an interview with Matthew Rosencrans with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Last week, they updated their hurricane prediction for this season. They say there will be more hurricanes and other storms than they expected earlier in the year. We'll find out why. After that interview comes messages from our wonderful, wonderful sponsors and patrons. Then it will be time for Rebecca to make her contribution. Rebecca, what will you be talking about this week?
I'm doing a little segment which I've named Precambrian Larryland, about things named after St. Lawrence in North America.
Wow, that's an incredibly specific subtopic.
You'd think, but really not so much.
After we hear from Rebecca, we have ecological news from around the world. This time we have a breaking, incredible blockbuster story that may well end the nuclear power industry. An ambitious claim. We know that we have nuclear power workers from Davis-Besse who listen to this show. You're not going to want to miss this story. You're not going to want to miss this story. So, Canada has still not updated its National Wildlands Fire Situation Report. It's been 2 weeks since the last update on their website. We know that the situation is continuing to deteriorate. There are thousands of firefighters from many different countries deployed across Canada. We also know that many communities in Canada, including Yellowknife, the capital and largest city in the Northwest Territories, are being evacuated by air and road at this very moment. But we don't have current numbers on the fires or the area burned. This past week in our home in Bowling Green, some interesting things happened that kind of illustrated an important ecological principle called punctuated equilibrium. What that fancy phrase means is that things can go along pretty much the same way for a long time, but suddenly big changes happen all at once. In our yard this year, our invasive wisteria plant, which seemed to be kind of just growing alongside our house, decided to explode in its growth. We started pulling up wisteria vines and discovered they were everywhere, climbing up every bush in our yard, filling parts of the yard with its shoots. It even found a hole in the foundation and sent vines into the basement of the house. This was the year that the equilibrium of that wisteria plant was punctuated by a tremendous spurt of growth.
Is wisteria poisonous? I think it's poisonous.
Probably if you ingest it, but we haven't suffered any ill effects thus far, so fingers crossed.
Not making it for your dinner salad. That's probably for the best.
Maybe some tea, herbal tea.
Maybe not. Maybe not, at least till we look it up.
In evolution, punctuated equilibrium means that new species can appear suddenly, without a gradual transformation of one species to another. There is support for this in the fossil record. There are many species which suddenly appear in that fossil record without any kind of warning. Species can also disappear just as quickly. One interesting aspect of the theory is that once a species suddenly appears, it stays pretty much the same for as long as it's around. This is seen as further support for the idea that evolution occurs in spurts rather than slow drifts. Of course, there are many examples of species that do gradually evolve as well. Biologists now believe that both gradualism and punctuated equilibrium occur. The debates now are raging over what the percentages are. Current consensus is that a little over half of evolution occurs in sudden jumps. In geology too, we see sudden massive changes. Ice ages can begin with incredible speed, geologically speaking. As ice ages end, the melting glaciers can create tremendous lakes stuck behind ice dams. When those ice dams finally break, huge areas can be reshaped forever in an instant. In North America, the most famous example was the glacial Lake Missoula. 15,000 years ago, it scoured the northwest part of the continent with 500 cubic miles of water that poured out and down to the ocean in just 48 hours. The changes that flood made to the landscape are still clearly visible today. The East Coast also had a similar, huge glacial lake flood about 8,000 years ago. An ice dam that had been holding back meltwater, greater than 7 times all the Great Lakes today combined, broke, and all that water poured into the Atlantic, stopping the flow of the mid-Atlantic ocean current, causing new glaciers to form in Europe when the warm Atlantic waters stopped flowing up to the north. The point is, behind punctuated equilibrium, like a spinning top, things can go along pretty much the same for a long time, and then suddenly the top falls over and goes spinning across the floor. It's time for some punctuated equilibrium in our human society. Something else that's been happening in Bowling Green this week is the annual National Tractor Pull Competition. This is the largest tractor pull in the United States, probably the world. The roar of the tractor engines can be heard for more than 5 miles in every direction. Last night, and in fact...
And when he says heard, he means heard enough that you feel like putting earplugs 5 miles away.
Yes.
As I recall, having lived in this town before.
As we record today.
Not just heard in the distance or something.
We can hear it in the background.
Yeah.
It is very prevalent. Last night they were pulling well towards midnight. Most of the tractors that participate in this competition bear little resemblance to the farming machines you'll see in the fields. Some of them have over 3,000 horsepower. Although tractor pulls started out back in the 1800s with horses, for the past century they've been run with gas-powered engines. Laying in bed trying to sleep over the roar of tractors more than 2 miles away, one could realize that the tractor pull is really a celebration of the internal combustion engine. What the audience in the stands experience is their entire body being shaken by the vibrations being sent through the air by the enormous pistons, changing chemical fossil fuel energy into mechanical energy. That deafening roar and the bone-shaking vibrations are just symptoms of the internal combustion engine's inefficiency. All that energy that is shaking you is not doing the work of pulling the load. That inefficiency can get your adrenaline pumping when you're in the stands, cheering for the pullers, but we as a society have reached a point where we should abandon that as our primary energy source. As compared to electric motors, which are quiet partially because they are so efficient. There's no cylinders banging up and down, no contained explosions releasing waste, noise, and heat to create mechanical energy. It's just a quiet transfer of magnetic energy into mechanical motion that is 4 times as efficient as internal combustion. We're at a point of sudden change with fossil fuel-powered engines. We have to stop using them very quickly, either because we've chosen to switch to more efficient, cleaner technologies, or because our systems for supporting them will collapse because of global warming. This is the year many different measures of global warming, which have kind of gradually been drifting upwards, took off like rockets. Global average temperatures are spiking at a rate never before seen in human history. I think the 7 hottest days recorded have been in the last 10 days.
Yep.
Something like that. The amount of sea ice in the Arctic and Antarctic are the lowest ever recorded for this time of year. The glaciers on Greenland are melting faster than ever before, faster than scientists thought possible just a few years ago. One effect you may have noticed yourself is humidity is increasing.
I found out apparently Hawaii has more wildfires than you might think on a regular basis.
As in not just this most recent one, but just...
Yeah, but
throughout the
it's the
year.
biggest and meanest and nastiest they've had, I think, for a while, maybe ever.
Right. Because one effect of carbon dioxide doing a better job of holding water vapor in the air is that as the amount of CO2 increases, the amount of water in the air increases. This increases the heat index or wet bulb temperature, so people can die of heat in lower temperatures because there's so much more humidity that sweat can't cool their bodies down anymore.
So that sounds very unpleasant.
Yes.
It sounds like a bad way to go.
100% humidity.
Yeah.
Gain no benefit from sweating. People are dying in record numbers in fires all over the globe. As we record this, while the official count of the dead in the Maui fires is over 100, there are still over 1,000 unaccounted for. Clearly, in the world, we are at an inflection point. 2023 is a point in time where we can point to the rapid, catastrophic changes that mark punctuated equilibrium. Now will begin the period of uncertainty and chaos where the old equilibrium collapses and a new one can establish itself. How long this will take and what the new equilibrium will look like is impossible to say right now because we're still continuing to change the variables. We're still putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at a near suicidal rate. The May peak for CO2 measured at Mauna Loa this year was again a record, as it has been every year for decades. But this year, the rate that the CO2 increased from last year was much higher than it was for the years before. In other words, this is the year that the acceleration accelerated. Scientists are still cautious about putting all these things together to make predictions about how catastrophic these changes will be. But they are rapidly losing that caution as indicator after indicator says we're at the point of no return. One of the most dramatic indicators we have right now is sea surface temperature. We've been reporting on this story for months now, that sea surface temperatures leapt into record territory back in June and have stayed there ever since. Ocean heat is a large factor of what drives storms and hurricanes. The result of this sudden and dramatic increase in sea surface temperatures is that the Hurricane Center, as part of NOAA, has increased its prediction for the number and strength of storms during this year's Atlantic hurricane season. We were very fortunate to be able to arrange an interview with NOAA's chief hurricane forecaster, Matthew Rosencrans. He's going to explain why they changed their forecast and what this means for the public. Let's go to the interview. Here on For a Green Future, we interview a number of scientists, all with ecological backgrounds. And so here we have with us today a spokesperson for the NOAA. Could you please share your name and title with our audience?
Sure. My name is Matthew Rosencrans, and I'm NOAA's lead for the Seasonal Hurricane Outlook, as well as the Climate Testbed Director.
So how much time do you spend thinking about hurricanes at your time with the NOAA?
some people might characterize it as an inordinate amount of time, but it's a significant portion of my job, from analyzing the data to making the forecasts, to interactions with the National Hurricane Center and the research labs and the academic partners that are looking at better ways to forecast hurricanes, better ways to communicate hurricane forecasts, the entire gamut. I mean, even down to what colors do we use on our presentation so that way it's more interpretable by anyone who might download them. So we really analyze this from every single angle to get the information across, and it's a significant portion of my year every year.
This year, back on August 10th, the Climate Prediction Center increased their prediction for the level of activity this year from near normal to above normal. What prompted that change?
Two factors went into that. The first was that the sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic Ocean for the June and July period were the warmest on record since 1950.
Wow.
And that's about when we have really good data for hurricanes in the Atlantic as well. So that's when we start the analysis. And yeah, the wow is, I mean, it's not just a small record-breaking amount. It's about a third of a degree higher than the previous record. So it's quite warm. We've seen some relaxation of that during the month of August, but that period and that warmth really would give any storms that could form a lot of the fuel that they would need. We also looked at El Nino and in the Pacific and how that's translating to impacts in the world. And we were seeing that translation of impacts be slightly delayed. So we thought we could have at least an active August, ending of August into early September, that could really have the first part of the season be more reflective of the local Atlantic conditions rather than the kind of inhibited factors from the El Nino.
Do you think that period of activity will change permanently going forward into the future?
I'm not sure what you mean by period of activity.
For El Nino?
Well, no, it really depends on when the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, kind of when they peak out every year, and that'll be completely dependent on each event.
Okay.
And how those impacts manifest in a changing climate, that is an area of open research. We're looking at it internally at the Climate Prediction Center. We're working with our research partners at various federal laboratories and universities as well. There's lots of published papers on it, and it's really an open area of research, very on that work.
With the new above normal prediction, how many and what kind of storms might we expect to see this year?
Yeah, so the updated outlook now calls for 14 to 21 named storms, which includes tropical storms and subtropical storms, 6 to 11 hurricanes, and potentially 2 to 5 major hurricanes, which are those with category 3, 4, or 5 winds of 111 miles per hour or greater.
What does it take to become a named storm? And how powerful does a storm have to be to become a hurricane?
So to become a named storm, you'd have to have 39 mile an hour per winds, and to become a hurricane, 74 miles per hour.
So
those measurements are typically done in knots, and we can do that conversion if we need to.
So we're expecting major hurricanes this year already. How much energy is there in a hurricane versus a major hurricane?
So a hurricane would be 74 miles per hour up to 110 miles per hour. Major hurricane, 111 or greater. The energy dissipation or the power dissipation index with a storm is slightly different. So the energy would be just the kinetic energy of the storm. You could do an integrated energy, and that's usually the velocity of all the wind vectors squared. Or the power dissipation, which is the energy, which is the wind speeds cubed. There's a few different ways of measuring it. We at NOAA will take the wind speed that is every 6 hours. that a storm is out there in the Atlantic. We square it and we sum that up across the entire year, and then we divide by 10,000 just to make the number reasonable. So that's how we do it, and then we call that the ACE, the accumulated cyclone energy.
Could you give an example of how that compares to more other natural occurrences, or to the destructive power of that energy?
I really can't, because a lot of times these storms are out there over the open waters and don't really destroy anything.
Sure.
So the best kind of way of looking at that would be with the Saffir-Simpson scale, and that has a relation between winds and likely damages. There's a lot of literature on that as well, and I can refer you to those web pages and those documentations.
Absolutely. Here on For a Green Future, we've been following a number of indicators which seem to be going off the charts this year, such as global average temperatures, sea ice decline, and other factors. One of those indicators that you mentioned already is Atlantic sea surface temperatures. Could you talk a little bit more about Atlantic surface temperatures this year as compared to previous years, and what those might mean in terms of global weather patterns, especially into the future?
So my expertise really lies in making hurricane forecasts for this year, as far as decadal trends and the relationship to anthropogenic global warming. There's some research that shows it's likely to cause the winds in hurricanes to be 2 to 10% stronger, the winds up to about 11% stronger. So the rain 2 to 10%, and the winds up to about 11% stronger. We've only seen a small fraction of that so far, about 2 to 3% for either one of those variables. So let's say you have a storm that's already got 100-mile-an-hour winds. You might see climate change might be responsible for currently making that storm have 103 miles per hour. So we're not seeing a great impact in that. In the Atlantic basin, we don't really see any major relationship in the number of storms related to the changing temperatures on the planet. So we haven't seen that relationship. And then there's debatable evidence. Some studies see it, some studies don't, as far as how fast the storms move, where they recurve, and at what latitude they recurve. Those are still open areas from study, as far as, are they directly related to anthropogenic global warming? Are they more related to aerosol loading, since we changed kind of fuel patterns and fuel constituents in the 70s and kind of cleaned up the air coming off the east coast of the US? So there's a lot of different factors, and we haven't quite disentangled all of those yet.
Well, thank you for your time. If someone wanted to keep an eye on what's happening in terms of the hurricanes and other weather patterns, what resources does NOAA offer the public?
So the best resources for hurricanes are the National Hurricane Center, and that's available at hurricanes.gov. Or they can also go to their own local weather forecast office, which there's a local weather forecast office that covers every county in the lower 48, Alaska, Hawaii, and then we also have some overseas offices in Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico. So we cover a lot of areas, and states and U.S. territories. So weather.gov, and they can then click on where they live on the map. Then that would probably be their best place to get the up-to-date weather information.
Is there anything else you'd like to add for our audience before we go?
Yeah, I'd really like to urge everyone that while it's quiet now and there are no hurricanes in the Atlantic, take the time now to prepare. Ready.gov has great checklists for what to look for and what to do to prepare for the upcoming hurricane season. So really take that time now while it's quiet, because getting supplies, plywood, sandbags, making a plan with your family, it's much easier now when it's quiet than when you might have only 2 or 3 days to do all your preparations.
All right. That's
All
all the
right.
time we have with the NOAA. Thanks once again to the NOAA and Matthew Rosencrans for that interview. Now let's hear from our sponsors.
For a Green Future is also brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They also restore wildlife habitats and lead people on outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. There are several ways to get a hold of them and find out what's happening. One is to call them at 419-353-1897. Another is to visit their website, www.wcparks.org. The website again is www.wcparks.org. They are also available on all social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and many others. Just search for WC Parks. That's the Wood County Park District, and we're very grateful for their support.
For a Green Future is also brought to you by our patrons. These are people who have gone to patreon.com, patreon.com, and searched for a Green Future. There they signed up to have a small donation come out of their accounts every month. We thank our patrons because without them, we couldn't do this show. All right, Rebecca, your turn at the mic. What do you have for us this week?
Alrighty. Okay. Precambrian Larryland here is a segment which I learned, I named after an album by a band whose name I'm not sure I can say, but it ends in Surfers. And they did an album at one point that was called Electric Larryland, named after the Jimi Hendrix album Electric Ladyland. So it's kind of a satire of a satire. Anyway, yeah, so I did this because a lot of things which have a couple of major things which have the name Laurentia or St. Lawrence on them are date from the Precambrian era. And there are a steaming metric crap ton of them. First of all, there's the North American Craton. A craton is the old and stable part of the continental lithosphere. I may have mentioned it before, I'm not sure, but yeah. It's kind of the core of the continent. And so you have like a central craton which tends to stick together, and on the edge you have something called terrains, which are sort of little crusty bits that have stuck to the craton as it blundered around the globe, bashing into things in a giant game of bumper cars that lasts for millennia.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. So, yeah, it comes from the word kratos, which means strength. The lithosphere, excuse me, being the Earth's crust and mantle. That's what that means. And they're found usually on the interior of tectonic plates. There's also, so most of the Laurentian craton is here in North America, but little bits of it are now terrains clinging to Scotland and Greenland.
So this was from the time of Pangea, where the whole landmass was all together?
I can't even remember. This is the thing. It's wandered over and bumped into other continents on the other side of the Atlantic a couple of times and then come back.
Wow,
It gets around, I'm telling you.
A migratory subterranean core.
Yeah, a lot of them are, actually. They're kind of always in motion. We just don't see it because we're like hummingbirds. We last 5 minutes, But yeah, it's been a continent alternating with being parts of larger continents and supercontinents over its history. And it's made up of a patchwork of multiple terrains, what they call. A terrain being a tectonostratigraphic terrain, basically. It's a tectonostratigraphic term. It's a crust fragment formed on a tectonic plate and sutured to the crust in another plate. So Laurentia, the terrains are assembled around a network of orogenic belts. Yeah, this is Becca learns more new words. Orogenic being mountain producing, I believe. That's what orogenesis is. Okay, so that's the craton, named after St. Lawrence, the Laurentian craton. There's also the Laurentian shield, which is a large area of exposed Precambrian igneous and metamorphic rocks. It's just really basically the bit where the shield crops out of the surface. That's just what they call it. The craton is named after the shield, which is named after the mountain range, which is named after the river, which is named after St. Lawrence of Rome, who was a martyred deacon in the year 258, martyred by the Emperor Valerian. And I have more if we need to keep going. Do we need to keep going? A little bit more? Okay.
Yeah.
Other things. There's the Laurentides, which is a Quebec region north of Montreal, transformed by the Laurentian Mountains. Includes forests, ski trails, ski resorts, spas. Contains only part of the Laurentian Mountains. There are other places too. They kind of sprawl out through 3 or 4 provinces, I believe. The Laurentides has basically 20,000 square kilometers and 589,000 some people as of 2016. It's originally Algonquin territory, settled by English and French later in the 1800s. Popular for getaways from Montreal, New England, and Ontario. Also, there's some lumbering that goes on there. They've been having trouble with moose vehicle collisions quite a bit lately, I read. They're trying to study that to figure out where... Mooses are big. You're going too fast if you hit a moose, I think.
Meese.
Mooses. Yeah, they're also having an issue with invasive, what is this? Milfoil from Australia. It's a water plant that's getting in their lakes.
In
apparently.
Canada. Huh.
Yeah, all over North America, in fact. So also, St. Lawrence River has its headwaters in North Ontario and comes out in the North Atlantic. So, yeah, it connects basically all of the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. Primary drainage, it's the primary drainage outflow of the Great Lakes Basin. Goes through Ontario, Quebec, and New York. The foundation of the St. Lawrence Seaway, which has cruises. I didn't know. I wonder if they're expensive. It's Great Lakes cruises, which are super expensive. But yeah, the Seaway is a system of locks, canals, and channels that the U.S. and Canada cobbled together between 1954 and 1959. It goes from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Duluth at the west side of Superior, and is 370 miles long. And of interest to me because you always hear about that because I was born in Muskegon, Michigan. It's where my grandparents lived. If we went there in the summer, we always went to something called the Seaway Festival, which is sort of Muskegon County's county fair, basically.
Sure.
It's got rides
On the
and
lakes.
parades. Yeah, basically. So the Seaway, super important to the development of the Great Lakes in general and Muskegon in particular. And then, also there's something called the Laurentian Abyss, or FAN, which is an underwater depression off the east coast of Canada in the Atlantic. There's also the Laurentian Divide, which is a continental divide in North America, which separates the Hudson Bay watershed on the north from the Gulf of Mexico watershed on the south. That's right. On the south, and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed to the southeast. Never heard of any of this stuff before I started looking at it. Also the name of a bank in Canada and a library in Rome.
Well, why not? St. Lawrence was the patron saint of archivists and librarians, I think. So I guess his name just comes up, when people wanted to name important parts of the ecosystem.
Well, that's interesting because I didn't, I'm the black sheep of the family in the sense of not having a library science degree. 3 or 4 out of my nuclear family have one, so I consider myself to be a lapsed librarian. I can probably still marry librarians without having to convert. So ethnically, I'm a librarian. I don't know.
Well.
So yes, that's Precambrian Land. It's everywhere. You just weren't aware of it before.
Yeah. A great insight into naming conventions of early science.
It's just like one thing started out being named after this guy. It was a Christian martyr in the 1st century or something, and now it's everywhere. Everything is called St. Lawrence.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca.
Now for the ecological news part of our show. We'll start off with some good news. The oil tanker disaster that has been threatening the Red Sea has been resolved, reports Damia Cherry on behalf of Greenpeace on August 11th. The oil tanker FSO Safer has been abandoned off the coast of Yemen since 2015. This, of course, as a result of the still ongoing conflict there. The scope of that potential disaster cannot be understated. The oil tanker contains approximately 4 times the amount spilled during the Exxon Valdez disaster, about 1.13 million barrels worth. This, of course, would mean the destruction of the Red Sea ecosystem. Happily, however, the UN-led 3-week-long operation to transfer the oil out of the decayed freighter ended in a success. However, unfortunately, the story is far from over. Now that the oil itself is more safely stored in the newly named supertanker Yemen, the problem arises of what to do with the now derelict FSO Safer. The UN-organized operation has already run into funding troubles, partially relying on crowdsourcing its capital, and this lack of income could mean the FSO Safer will not be properly disposed of. The residuals of its hull could still make for an environmental hazard. And of course, Greenpeace MENA's executive director Giwa Nakat points out, the real failure here is on the companies that have claimed no responsibility and implicitly allowed the situation to get this bad. He notes, quote, "The oil companies behind the Safer debacle are the same companies driving the climate crisis. These fossil fuel corporations are obscenely rich and recording staggering profits, but have not shown a shred of responsibility. They should be made to pay for the historical and future damage their operations cause." But it is nonetheless a relief for the millions of residents of the region that are already suffering a humanitarian crisis that the ecological disaster is thwarted, meaning we've made the world just a little bit safer to live in. On the tail of that success for humanity comes our next story about a more worrying report in the field of botany, where the scientists of China, in collaboration with colleagues in the United States, have found that the rise of photosynthesis in recent years has slowed down, as reported by Bob Yika of phys.org, originally published in the journal Science. The process of photosynthesis, of course, describes how plants take in CO2 and water and release oxygen. Over the last 40 years, the reporting group has monitored the rate of photosynthesis occurring by measuring certain environmental statistics. Previous research has suggested that as the Earth's CO2 density increases due to the man-made changes in climate, the levels of photosynthesis would also continue rising in proportion. The data gathered from 1986 to 2000 does show this trend, but the data from 2000 through the present day suggests that the rate of photosynthesis growth is slowing and may plateau in the future. Scientists have been hopeful that this increase in photosynthesis would be a notable break in the effects of global warming, but it seems that the atmosphere is growing both hotter and also less humid, which means less water is available for photosynthesis. It just goes to show that although the planet would still be here after humankind, it can't save us from extinguishing ourselves. On the subject of China, carbonbrief.org reported on August 10th that China's CO2 emissions in quarter 2 of 2023 rebounded to 2021's record levels. This is not a surprise to those of us that are paying attention. China is by far the world's largest CO2 emitter, accounting for more than double of the United States emissions. The exact value resides around 1% higher than the record levels of 2021. The analysis by Carbon Brief suggests that there are 2 major factors for these highs. Firstly, the emissions measured in 2022 were artificially low, as the COVID-19 pandemic was still affecting much of the country at that time. Secondly, the ongoing drought in the region has caused a massive decrease in hydroelectric power, a source usually accounting for 16% of China's electricity. This demand for power must now be met by other, less carbon-friendly sources. At the moment, that means coal. Since the start of the year, China has begun production on average of 2 coal power plants per week, more than 64 plants so far. The production of coal-based steel is also a large factor in China's pollution, with power, steel production, and cement production being the 3 major offending sectors. This trend continues despite China's plan to begin phasing out coal-based solutions starting in 2025. Many current projects relying on coal will still be completed after that date, but that's no surprise. What is new is the surprising growth rates of wind and solar in China. Solar and wind installations have increased 150% and 80% respectively. This makes them the world leader of wind and solar energy production, and if this rate increases according to plan, China's emissions could plateau and energy demand growth could be met in as soon as 2 years. There continues to be the contrast between the relative ease of solar and wind growth and the supposed necessity of coal plants should not go unnoticed. China's all-of-the-above energy policy is ultimately less effective than if they had gone more strongly into wind and solar production from the start. Although their current energy grid is tainted with the use of the world's enemy, coal, we should still take a page from China's playbook and strive to expand more on our own wind and solar capacity. We now must turn to the shores of Texas, where back in March of 2019, lines of razor wire were installed along the U.S.-Mexico border in a ridiculous attempt of the administration of that time to increase border security. At that time, the Center for Biological Diversity released a statement condemning the act, citing the necessity of the endangered animal populations nearby to have unimpeded movement and selection of mates. This razor wire affects those rarer species such as Sonoran jaguars and Mexican gray wolves by dramatically limiting the availability of resources and increasing the chances of inbreeding. It was installed with no public input, no environmental impact study, and without regard for the wildlife so affected. That brings us to last month, where Governor Abbott of Texas installed buoys equipped with blades and lines of razor wire in the middle of and on the shores of the Rio Grande. This, combined additionally with the forceful changing of the riverbed and supposedly authorized by disaster declarations, is an absolutely senseless move with no grounding in reality. Many private landowners have had their property modified or lined with undesired barriers, and again, there have been no studies as to the impact of these operations on the ecology of the land. It seems that Governor Abbott is taking any chance he has to inflict harm on his fellow humans, as well as to the balance of the ecosystem he resides in. His moves have brought ire from the public, the Mexican government, and the Biden administration, which has plans to sue if the buoys are not swiftly removed. As of this time, there have been 2 bodies so far found on the buoys. For an example of how governments might improve the lives of their citizens and the health of the world overall, we need only turn to Germany, where they've just passed a €212 billion climate fund, reports Oliver Nguyen for Euractiv.com on August 9th. This money will be spent on projects intended to promote green initiatives and spent between 2024 and 2027. One such, and the largest, goal is the energy-efficient renovation of buildings, with $27 billion already allocated for the installation of climate-friendly heat pumps to replace the traditional oil and gas heating systems. Heat pumps are those systems that rely on transferring heat to or away from your residence as opposed to directly heating or cooling the air, and might lower energy usage by as much as 50%. Definitely a system to be considered for your own house, if available. In addition to this initiative, the German government plans on mandating any heating system installed after 2024 to be powered at least 65% by renewable energies. This is effectively a ban on new natural gas installations, a move that should certainly continue Germany's trend of decreasing carbon intensity as of April of this year. Other initiatives that will be funded from this money include $4.7 billion for electric vehicle infrastructure, $3.8 billion for the development of the hydrogen industry, and over $12 billion to invest in the Deutsche Bahn, the countrywide railroad network. It would be great to have a similar train network in the United States, but I guess we'll just have to keep hoping for that. Germany is continuing to be a great example of what a country can do if they take seriously the threat, global warming. Happily, there are some in the United States that recognize our society's current existential threat. Increasingly, the younger generations are demanding that their predecessors take some responsibility as to how the future might turn out. Recently, this takes the form of a group of 16 youths that have sued the state of Montana as to the policies that Montana has promoted, encouraging their fossil fuel industries. A press release by Our Children's Trust on August 14th describes the situation in detail. The case is Held versus State of Montana, presided over by Judge Kathy Seeley, and the ruling is that the state of Montana has violated the youth's constitutional rights of equal protection, dignity, liberty, health and safety, and public trust due to the endangering of their environment. The decision rendered certain Montana laws promoting fossil fuels unconstitutional and found sufficient evidence that the youths have sustained significant injuries from these policies. Moreover, that the government had a substantial role in causing that injury and should change their conduct moving forward. Of course, we can't appropriately summarize the 103 pages of the judge's decision, but if the topic interests you, I strongly recommend reading just the first few pages describing the procedural history of the case. To me, it seems like the defendants, the government, are on their back foot the entire time. The history is full of sequences similar to the government changes a law or passes a bill, followed immediately by the defendants filing for dismissal. In other words, it was already known by all parties that these laws were unconstitutional, at the least morally wrong, and the government's administration was trying to avoid their comeuppance by preemptively ceding the argument. This case is a fantastic example of what can happen as a result of citizen-led inquiries and calls to action, and we should all learn something from the youths of Montana as to how we should expect better of our government that is supposedly by the people, for the people. As a result of this case, the state must change policies to include the impact to global warming going forward, especially taking greenhouse gas emissions into account as a metric. That report comes in contrast to our next story, which is that the trilateral summit between the United States, Japan, and South Korea has failed to address the plans to dump tritium-contaminated water from Fukushima into the ocean. I'd like to read now the statement of the Coalition Against Nukes on that subject. Quote, "First of all, we are extremely disappointed to learn from President Yoon that Japan's dumping of tritium into the Pacific was not part of the trilateral discussions. This is an extremely important matter that will affect the health and well-being of future generations for the next century. It should not have been ignored. There are currently protests in South Korea and Japan against this dumping. Most of the other Pacific nations also oppose it. They see it as part of the legacy of nuclear contamination, which has been a curse on the Pacific nations since the dawn of the atomic age. The Prime Minister of Japan mentioned the importance of promoting liberal democracies. Healthy democracies pay attention to the issues that concern their citizens. In this case, the concerns of both citizens and allies were ignored. To be clear, we oppose the plan to dump tritium into the Pacific. We agree with the statement issued by the National Association of Marine Labs that such dumping will inevitably cause harm to all forms of life in the Pacific. The dumping is also unnecessary. Tritium disappears after 120 years. It could be safely stored until then. All this policy does is save money for TEPCO at the expense of the environment. We applaud some of the other goals announced at the summit, including the commitment to fighting cancer. However, it is better not to cause cancer in the first place. Also, even if we succeed in finding a cure for cancer among humans, this doesn't absolve us from the responsibility of preventing disease in the non-human members of our oceans communities. Dumping tritium will cause health effects, including cancers. No amount of dilution reduces the amount of radiation dumped into the sea. The leaders also talked about the goals of the summit to promote peace, security, and economic prosperity among the three nations. We remind those leaders that there can be no peace, no security, and no economic prosperity without the underlying support of healthy ecosystems. Our oceans are already under unprecedented stress from multiple sources, including microplastics, global heating, and pollution. Adding a new stress in the form of radioactive dumping is unacceptable. In conclusion, we call on all nations to urgently come out against the planned dumping of radioactive water into the Pacific and call for a global ban of all such dumping from all sources in the future. That was a statement from the Coalition Against Nukes. For our next story, we go to New York State, where Governor Kathy Hochul has signed into law a bill banning the dumping of radioactive waste into the Hudson River, her office reports. The law prevents Holtec, the company responsible for decommissioning the Indian Point reactor, from continuing its plans of offloading 1 million gallons of tritium-infused water into the Hudson Valley region. This bill passed overwhelmingly by 100 to 44, with the only oppositions consisting of Republicans. Holtec has a plan to contest the law, claiming that the responsibility for regulating radiation lies only with the federal EPA and NRC, not at the state level. Holtec has similar plans for the Pilgrim Point and the Palisades nuclear plant cleanups projects, in which they are trying to dump wastewater into the Boston Harbor and into Lake Michigan, respectively. In other words, Holtec is yet another example of a company attempting to make a quick profit from the nuclear industry at the expense of the general public and the entire world. For now, at least, the citizens of New York's Hudson Valley region are safe from their destructive tendencies. Finally, our lead story tonight comes from the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, and has large implications for many fields. The title? Cancer Death Risk After Low-Dose Ionizing Radiation Underestimated. This is a 70-year-long study that analyzed the deaths of workers in the nuclear industry in the UK, France, and the United States. These are the most recent findings of the International Nuclear Workers Study, or INWORKS. Prior to this research, the effects of radiation on the risks of dying from cancer have been estimated mainly by studying the survivors of the atomic bombs that ended World War II. That data is what has guided the protections required for workers in the field. However, as these guidelines were based on survivors of an extremely high dose of radiation, not enough importance has been put on protections from low doses over a prolonged period. This threat is backed up by the data. Out of 103,500 worker deaths surveyed, 28,000 were due to solid cancers. Those deaths were then evaluated as to their radiation exposure 10 years before. The risk of death increased roughly 52% per unit of radiation cumulative absorbed per gray. But, and here's the kicker, the workers accumulated the lowest doses of radiation, lower than 100 milligrays, had a doubly large chance of death by solid cancer than their doses would otherwise suggest. In other words, very low doses of radiation are not as safe as the current environmental and workplace regulations assume. If you are exposed to any measurable amount of radiation, it will significantly increase your risk of cancer. You may be thinking that other personal variables, such as smoking or exposure to asbestos, would impact this result, but the trend continues even after these factors have been eliminated. In addition, the study notes that an analysis based only on more recent years highlights this trend even further, meaning that the result persists even through the weaker data set of the earliest years of this industry. These findings overturn decades of established hazard prevention, which have erroneously presented low-dose rate exposures as being less harmful than high-dose effects. The study is definitive in its conclusion. Per unit of radiation, accumulated low-dose exposure is more harmful than high-dose. This sentiment, of course, reinforces what we have been saying here at For a Green Future for years. No amount of radiation should be considered safe in the workplace or in the environment. The efforts of those in the nuclear industry to downplay and casually disregard these low-dose exposures are wrong. For a possible explanation of this effect, this phenomenon, we interviewed Chris Busby on this topic back in May of 2022. And you can find that in our episode entitled Low-Level Radiation Equals High-Level Cancer. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. I hope we've brought you an appropriate amount of entertainment, and you can look forward to us being on the air for next week. This is Joe DeMare signing off.
I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!